Picture this, November 28th, 1889. The most powerful families in America gather inside the Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over silk gowns and diamond tiaras. Orchestra music fills the marble halls. But everyone wears a mask. Venetian masks, feathered masks, masks encrusted with jewels. Because tonight isn't just Thanksgiving, it's the social event of the decade, a masquerade ball where New York's elite can hide behind beautiful lies. And somewhere in that glittering crowd, a killer waits. At precisely 10:47 p.m., a woman's scream pierces through the waltz music. In the library, surrounded by first edition books and oil paintings of dead aristocrats, a body lies on the Persian carpet. A young woman in an emerald gown, her white mask still tied around her face, a wine glass shattered beside her pale hand. Poison. But here's the problem. In a room full of masks, nobody knows who she really is, and nobody wants to find out. The police are called, but they arrive with orders whispered from City Hall. Make this disappear. The Astors, the Morgans, the Roosevelts, they don't want scandal staining their family names. They don't want newspapers printing stories about murder and champagne in the same sentence. So they call in someone they can control, an old detective named Thomas Byrnes, former chief of the New York police, the man who invented the third-degree interrogation. But Byrnes isn't who they think he is anymore. He's tired of protecting the rich while the poor hang for stealing bread. What follows is not just a murder investigation. It's a war between old money and new justice, between family secrets buried for generations and one man's obsession with truth. Because as Byrnes pulls back the masks, he discovers this wasn't a random killing. This was revenge. This was about something that happened decades ago, something the elite thought they'd buried along with their conscience. And the killer? The killer is still in that ballroom, still dancing, still wearing that mask, planning the next move. This is the story of the Thanksgiving Masquerade murder, a case that was never officially solved, a crime that history tried to forget, and a night when America's most powerful families learned that some secrets refuse to stay buried. Welcome to New York City, 1889, where everyone has something to hide, and murder wears the finest clothes. To understand what happened that Thanksgiving night, you need to understand New York City in 1889. This wasn't the New York you know today. This was a city being torn in half. On one side, Fifth Avenue, where marble mansions rose like temples to wealth, where families with names like Vanderbilt and Astor spent more on a single dinner party than a factory worker earned in 10 years. On the other side, the Lower East Side, where immigrants crammed into tenements, where children worked 14-hour days in sweatshops, where tuberculosis killed faster than anyone could count. And in between these two worlds, barely holding the center, stood men like Detective Thomas Byrnes. Byrnes was 56 years old that November, a thick-built Irishman with gray mutton chops and eyes that had seen every kind of human cruelty. He'd started as a beat cop in the Gas House District, the most violent neighborhood in America, where gangs like the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys settled disputes with clubs and knives. He'd worked his way up through pure brutality and brilliant detective work, eventually becoming chief of detectives. He'd created the Rogues Gallery, the first photographic database of criminals. He'd drawn an invisible line at Fulton Street and told every thief in New York, cross it into the financial district and I'll break you. And he'd made a fortune doing it, because in the Gilded Age, even justice had a price. By 1889, he'd officially retired, but his reputation remained. The man who could solve anything for the right people. The Vanderbilt mansion where the Masquerade took place wasn't just a house. It was a statement. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, grandson of the Commodore who'd built a railroad empire, had spent $3 million constructing this French Renaissance palace. It occupied an entire city block. It had 70 rooms, 30 fireplaces, and a ballroom that could hold 200 guests. The staircase was carved from cane stone imported from France. The walls were covered in silk brocade. Every door handle was gilded. This wasn't wealth. This was dominance, a physical declaration that some families stood above others, above laws, above consequences. The Thanksgiving Masquerade Ball of 1889 wasn't merely a party. It was a gathering of America's true government. Not the politicians in Washington, but the men who owned the politicians. J.P. Morgan, whose bank controlled more money than the U.S. Treasury. William Rockefeller, brother of John D., whose Standard Oil monopoly touched every lamp in America. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. had been invited before his death, and his son, young Theodore, a civil service commissioner, attended with his wife. These weren't just rich people. These were the 30 families who owned America, who decided which railroads got built, which wars got funded, which presidents got elected. And on this night, they all wore masks, as if pretending they were something other than what they truly were. But someone at that party knew the truth. Someone had waited years for this moment, for this perfect night, when everyone's face was hidden, when champagne flowed freely, when guards relaxed, because surely among this crowd of elites, what danger could exist? Someone had brought poison, not crude arsenic, but something elegant, something that worked slowly enough that the victim would have time to realize she was dying, but fast enough that she couldn't say who'd killed her. And when that emerald-dressed woman collapsed in the library, when her masked face hit that carpet, the killer simply melted back into the crowd, back into the waltz, back behind the safety of money and power. The question Detective Byrnes would spend the next 3 months trying to answer was simple and impossible. In a room full of liars wearing masks, how do you find the one telling the deadliest lie of all? Before we dive deeper into this mystery, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done if you were Detective Byrnes walking into that mansion? And what city are you watching from right now? Let me know below.
When Detective Thomas Byrnes arrived at the Vanderbilt mansion at 11:30 that night, the first thing he noticed was the silence. Not natural silence, but the manufactured kind. The silence of people who'd been told what not to say. 2 uniformed officers stood at the servants' entrance. young men with pale faces who looked relieved to see him. They'd been ordered to let no one leave, but they hadn't been told why. And the weight of guarding America's elite was crushing them. Byrnes nodded, said nothing, and walked past them into a world he knew well but would never belong to. The mansion's interior was still alive with nervous energy. Guests lingered in clusters, masks now removed, their faces showing irritation more than fear. These weren't people accustomed to inconvenience. A woman in diamonds complained loudly about missing her carriage home. A railroad magnate checked his pocket watch with theatrical impatience. But Byrnes had learned long ago to ignore what rich people said and watch what they did. And what he saw was interesting. Certain guests stayed close to certain other guests, forming protective circles. The Astors surrounded the Roosevelts. The Morgans stood with the Whitneys. Family alliances, business partnerships, shared secrets. Everyone protecting everyone else. The body still lay in the library. The mansion staff had covered it with a velvet curtain, as if death itself was something that could be made more presentable with expensive fabric. Byrnes pulled back the curtain and studied the victim in the harsh light of a gas lamp. She was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair pinned in the elaborate style fashionable among society women. Her emerald gown was Parisian, he could tell from the stitching. At least $500, more money than most New Yorkers earned in a year. Her jewelry was real, pearls and emeralds that matched her dress. But her hands told a different story. The nails were too short, the skin slightly roughened. These weren't hands that had never worked. This was a woman who'd climbed into wealth, not been born into it. The wine glass beside her body contained residue that smelled faintly of almonds. Cyanide, almost certainly. Quick, theatrical, the kind of poison someone chose when they wanted to make a statement. But here was the first real mystery. The glass was monogrammed with a V for Vanderbilt, part of the mansion's personal collection, which meant it came from inside the house. The killer hadn't brought poison in a flask or vial. They'd used the host's own crystal to commit murder. That spoke of either incredible boldness or intimate knowledge of the household. Cornelius Vanderbilt II himself entered the library, his mask long discarded, his face red with anger, and something else, fear perhaps, or guilt. He was 46 years old, master of $100 million fortune, but in that moment he looked like a child caught breaking something valuable. Byrnes had known Cornelius since the man was young, had protected Vanderbilt business interests from labor agitators and corporate rivals. But tonight, the old familiarity felt strained. Thomas, Vanderbilt said, using his first name as if they absolutely were not. This is a terrible accident. Clearly the woman had some sort of fit, perhaps a weak heart. We should let her family know quietly and... Byrnes cut him off. Who is she? The question hung in the air like smoke. Vanderbilt's eyes shifted left, a tell Byrnes had seen 1,000 times. The man was about to lie. We don't know, Vanderbilt said. The masks, you understand. It was anonymous by design. She could be anyone. But that was absurd.
This was a private ball, invitation only, with guest lists vetted by social secretaries who knew every family tree in New York. You didn't simply wander into a Vanderbilt masquerade. Someone had invited her. Someone knew exactly who she was. Byrnes walked the crime scene slowly, methodically, using techniques he'd refined over 30 years. The library was a large room, oak-paneled, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves containing volumes that had probably never been read. Latin classics, philosophical treatises, leather-bound collections that existed purely for display. There were two entrances, the main door from the hallway and a smaller door that led to a secondary corridor used by servants. The main door had been open all evening, guests wandering in and out. But the servants' door had a smudge of something on the handle. Powder, makeup perhaps, or flour from the kitchens. Someone had used that door recently. In the far corner of the library, behind a globe that showed the British Empire in aggressive pink, Byrnes found something else. A small notebook, dropped or hidden, its pages filled with handwriting. He pocketed it quickly before anyone else noticed. The writing was feminine, hurried, dates and initials that would mean nothing to most people. But Byrnes had spent decades learning to read the secret language of the city, and even at first glance, he recognized this for what it was: a ledger, a record of payments or debts. And one name appeared repeatedly: C.V., Cornelius Vanderbilt, or someone else with those initials? There were at least 15 guests at this party whose names matched. The guests themselves were a catalog of American power. J.P. Morgan stood near the fireplace, his distinctive red nose caused by rhinophyma, a skin condition he was deeply self-conscious about, making him instantly recognizable despite the maskless confusion. Morgan was 52, already the most powerful banker in the world, a man who would eventually finance the creation of U.S. Steel and save the American economy from collapse. But tonight he looked disturbed, his usual imperious demeanor cracked. When Byrnes approached him, Morgan's first words weren't about the victim. They were about the stock market. "This can't become public," Morgan said. "We're in delicate negotiations with British investors. Any scandal could cost millions." William Rockefeller, younger brother of John D. and vice president of Standard Oil, was more direct. He pulled Byrnes aside and spoke in the clipped tones of a man used to giving orders. "Find out who she was, make the problem disappear, and name your price." It was the old game, the one Byrnes had played for years. The rich committed crimes, Byrnes solved them quietly, and everyone profited. But something in Byrnes had changed. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was the memory of his own daughter, dead from cholera in the tenements, while families like these summered in Newport. Maybe it was simply exhaustion with a system that ground the poor into dust while protecting the wealthy from even minor inconvenience. Whatever the reason, Byrnes looked at Rockefeller and said something he'd never said before: no. The mansion's staff proved more useful than the guests. Byrnes interviewed them in the servants' quarters, a warren of small rooms beneath the main house where the people who actually ran this palace lived. The head butler, an Englishman named Charles Worth, had overseen the evening's logistics. He confirmed what Byrnes suspected. Every guest had been personally invited.
and the list had been triple-checked. No one entered without an invitation card bearing the Vanderbilt seal. But Worth also admitted something interesting. 3 extra place settings had been added at the last minute, on orders from Mrs. Alice Vanderbilt herself, Cornelius's wife. 3 mysterious guests added without explanation. A young Irish maid named Bridget Donnelly, barely 18, provided the breakthrough. She'd been working in the hallway near the library around 10:30, just before the murder. She'd seen a man in a black mask and formal tailcoat enter through the servants' door, the same door with the smudged handle. He'd been carrying something small in his hand, something that glinted in the gaslight. A glass, perhaps, or a bottle. Bridget hadn't thought much of it at the time. Wealthy men often snuck away from parties to drink privately or meet women. But when Byrnes pressed her for details, she remembered something crucial. The man had a distinctive walk, a slight limp in his left leg. And she'd seen his cufflinks when he passed. Gold, engraved with the seal of the Union Club, the most exclusive men's club in New York. The Union Club detail narrowed the suspects significantly. Only about 200 men belonged, and of those, maybe 30 were at tonight's party. Byrnes made a mental list. Morgan, no limp. Rockefeller, no limp. Theodore Roosevelt, definitely no limp. The man was famously athletic. But there were others. Hamilton Fish, grandson of the former Secretary of State, had broken his leg in a riding accident years ago and still favored it. Chester Arthur Jr., son of the late president, had been wounded in a streetcar accident. And then there was Reginald Claiborne, a name that made Byrnes pause. Claiborne was old money, even by Fifth Avenue standards. His family had owned Manhattan real estate since the Dutch colonial era. He was 42, unmarried, with a reputation for collecting art and hosting salons where writers and intellectuals gathered. He was also rumored to be homosexual, though such things were never spoken aloud in polite society. 3 years ago, Claiborne had been involved in a scandal. A young male servant had accused him of assault, but the case had disappeared after money changed hands and the servant left the city. Byrnes had worked that case personally, making the problem vanish as he'd done so many times. He'd always felt slightly sick about it. By 2 in the morning, Byrnes had made his decision. He would investigate this case properly, following the evidence wherever it led, even if it led straight into the heart of New York's ruling class. It was professional suicide, he knew. These families could destroy him, take away his pension, make sure he never worked again. But the woman lying dead under that velvet curtain deserved better than being swept under an expensive rug. And maybe, just maybe, Byrnes could do one decent thing before his career ended. He walked back into the main ballroom, where the exhausted guests still waited, and made an announcement. "No one leaves this house until I know who the victim is and who killed her. I don't care if you're a Vanderbilt or God himself. This is now a murder investigation."
By dawn, Byrnes had transformed the Vanderbilt mansion into an improvised police station. He'd requisitioned a sitting room on the second floor as his headquarters, ignoring the protests of the family. Guest lists were spread across an 18th century writing desk. Witness statements piled up on chairs that cost more than most houses. And slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical solution,
The identity of the victim began to emerge from the darkness. Her name was Catherine Brennan, though she'd been using the name Catherine Bellamy for the past 5 years. She was 27 years old, born in the Five Points neighborhood, the most notorious slum in America, where Irish and Italian immigrants fought for survival in buildings that collapsed regularly from neglect. Her father had died in the draft riots of 1863, beaten to death by a mob angry about being forced to fight in the Civil War. Her mother had worked as a seamstress until her lungs gave out from inhaling cotton dust. Catherine had been a factory girl, one of thousands who stitched garments 14 hours a day for pennies. But somewhere around 1884, she'd vanished from that world and reappeared in another. The transformation was remarkable. The factory girl had become a society woman, or at least a convincing imitation of one. She'd learned to speak differently, erasing the Irish brogue that marked immigrants as inferior. She'd learned which fork to use, which artists to praise, which topics were acceptable for female conversation. She'd acquired expensive clothes, jewelry, an apartment on Madison Avenue. And she'd been seen at the edges of high society events, not quite inside, but close enough to matter. Someone had educated her. Someone had funded her. Someone had built Catherine Brennan into Catherine Bellamy. But who? And more importantly, why? Byrnes found the answer in the notebook he'd recovered from the library. The entries were coded, but codes were meant to be broken. CV 500 February could mean anything. But when you found entries like CV 1000 June and CV 2000 August, a pattern emerged. Catherine had been receiving regular payments from someone with those initials, and the amounts were increasing. That suggested either blackmail or an affair, possibly both. In Victorian society, both were currency. The rich paid incredible sums to keep secrets buried. Illegitimate children, financial crimes, sexual scandals that could destroy social standing forever. But CV wasn't just Cornelius Vanderbilt. It was also Charles Vanderbilt, Cornelius's younger brother, who died in a gambling house shooting in 1882. It was Christian van Rensselaer, whose family had owned Dutch patron estates since the 1600s. It was Chester Vandermeer, a railroad lawyer who handled the legal side of several Gilded Age fortunes. Byrnes needed more evidence. He needed to understand not just who killed Catherine, but who created her in the first place. Because that person, he was increasingly certain, was either the murderer or the reason for the murder.
The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Alice Vanderbilt, Cornelius's wife. She was 46, a Gwyn by birth, from an old Southern family that had managed to stay wealthy despite losing the Civil War. She was also far more intelligent than her husband, though society rules meant she expressed that intelligence through charity work and decoration choices rather than business decisions. She summoned Byrnes to her private sitting room, a feminine space filled with orchids and watercolor paintings, and closed the door. "I knew who she was," Alice said quietly. "Catherine Bellamy. She'd been sending letters to my husband for months. I intercepted them." Byrnes produced a small bundle of letters tied with black ribbon, hidden in her writing desk. Byrnes read them right there, his face carefully neutral. They were love letters, or something like them. Passionate, desperate, threatening. Catherine claimed she and Cornelius had been involved years ago, before his marriage. She claimed he'd promised to support her, to help her rise above her circumstances. And when he'd married Alice instead, Catherine had been abandoned, sent back to the tenements with nothing but memories and rage. The recent letters demanded compensation, recognition, or, and here the blackmail became explicit, she would tell everyone the truth about their relationship and about something else, something the letters referred to only as the Philadelphia matter. Cornelius Vanderbilt denied everything, of course. When Byrnes confronted him in his mahogany-paneled study, surrounded by portraits of Vanderbilt ancestors who'd built the family fortune, Cornelius played the outraged aristocrat. "Pure invention," he insisted. "I never touched that woman. She's clearly deranged, probably invented this fantasy to extort money from us. These people, these immigrants, they see wealth and assume they can just take it." But his hands shook as he poured whiskey, and he wouldn't meet Byrnes's eyes. Guilty, Byrnes thought, but guilty of what? An affair? Blackmail payments? Murder? The Philadelphia matter proved harder to crack. Byrnes sent telegrams to Philadelphia police contacts, asking about scandals involving Vanderbilts circa 1880 to 1882. 2 days later, he received a reply that made him sit down slowly. In 1881, a young woman named Mary Catherine O'Brien, note the similar first names, had died in suspicious circumstances at a Philadelphia boarding house. She'd been 3 months pregnant. The investigation had been shut down abruptly after pressure from New York interests. No one was ever charged. The boarding house owner, interviewed years later, remembered one detail. The woman had been visited several times by a wealthy young man with distinctive mutton chop sideburns, who arrived in a carriage bearing a V crest.
So the story crystallized. Cornelius Vanderbilt, young and reckless before his marriage, had gotten a poor Irish woman pregnant. That woman had died, whether from a botched abortion, deliberate murder, or genuine medical complications, the records didn't say. And somehow, Catherine Brennan, another Irish woman from the same neighborhood, had learned the truth. Maybe she'd known Mary Catherine O'Brien. Maybe she'd been a friend or relative. And she'd spent years positioning herself to extract revenge or payment or both. The Masquerade Ball invitation had been her culmination, her moment to confront Vanderbilt publicly, to threaten him where he felt most powerful, in his own home, surrounded by his peers. But if Vanderbilt had a motive to kill Catherine, so did a dozen other people. Alice Vanderbilt, protecting her marriage and social position. Any business rival who wanted to embarrass the Vanderbilts. Or perhaps one of the other men in that notebook. Because as Byrnes dug deeper, he found that CV wasn't the only set of initials. There was RC receiving payments. Reginald Claiborne, the Union Club member with the limp? There was TR. Could that possibly be Theodore Roosevelt? There was WR and JPM and half a dozen others. Catherine hadn't been blackmailing one person. She'd been running a sophisticated operation, collecting secrets and selling silence to multiple wealthy men simultaneously. Byrnes spent a week interviewing everyone in that notebook. Most denied everything, some with lawyers present. But humans are terrible liars when confronted with evidence, and Byrnes had learned to read the microscopic signals. The pause before answering, the shift in eye contact, the suddenly formal language people use when they're constructing careful untruths. And slowly, a portrait emerged of Catherine Brennan's real life. She'd been working with someone else, someone who had access to high society secrets, someone who knew where bodies were buried, both literal and metaphorical, someone who'd helped her identify targets and craft blackmail strategies. That someone was a man named Jonathan Harding. He was 35, a social secretary who worked for several wealthy families, handling invitations and guest lists. His position gave him access to private correspondence, financial records, family gossip. He heard everything and was paid to forget everything, which made him perfectly positioned to remember everything for profit. Byrnes found him in a modest apartment in Chelsea, already packing to flee the city. When confronted, Harding collapsed immediately, confessing in a rush. Yes, he'd been working with Catherine. Yes, they'd been extracting money from various wealthy men. But he swore he hadn't killed her. In fact, he'd begged her not to attend the masquerade, sensed it was too dangerous, too brazen. Harding's testimony broke the case open. He revealed that Catherine had been planning something dramatic at the ball. She'd acquired information about multiple scandals, not just Vanderbilt's Philadelphia incident, but others. J.P. Morgan's secret financing of a failed mine that killed 47 workers. William Rockefeller's illegal stock manipulations. Theodore Roosevelt's father's corrupt dealings with Boss Tweed's political machine. She'd planned to make a scene, to threaten exposure unless paid massive sums immediately. It was blackmail on an unprecedented scale, and it was spectacularly foolish. Cornering one wealthy man is dangerous. Cornering a dozen simultaneously is suicide. So the question became, which of her targets had killed her? Or had they worked together, a conspiracy of the powerful protecting themselves?
Detective Byrnes had invented many interrogation techniques during his career, but the most famous and infamous was the third degree. It wasn't torture, not exactly, though it often felt like it to suspects. It was psychological warfare, hours of relentless questioning in a small, hot room. No lawyer present, no rest, just pressure and more pressure, until the human mind cracked and truth spilled out like water from a broken pipe. It was brutal, effective, and probably illegal, though the law in 1889 was flexible when dealing with the right kinds of people. Or the wrong kinds, depending on your perspective. But you couldn't use the third degree on J.P. Morgan. You couldn't lock Theodore Roosevelt in a sweltering room for 8 hours. These men had lawyers, political connections, newspaper editors in their pockets. So Byrnes had to be smarter, more subtle. He had to make them reveal themselves voluntarily, thinking they were in control, when really they were being maneuvered like chess pieces. It was the highest form of detective work, and Byrnes was a master at it. He started with Reginald Claiborne. The man clearly had secrets, the notebook proved that, and his reputation suggested what those secrets might be. In Victorian America, homosexuality wasn't just scandalous, it was criminal, punishable by imprisonment or worse. Men like Claiborne lived in constant terror of exposure, building elaborate facades of normalcy while pursuing dangerous relationships in secret. When Byrnes visited Claiborne's Fifth Avenue mansion, he didn't accuse or threaten. He simply sat in the man's art-filled drawing room and said, "Tell me about the young men." Claiborne's face went white. For a long moment, he said nothing, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Then, perhaps sensing that denial was pointless, he spoke. Yes, Catherine had known about his relationships. Yes, he'd been paying her, $2,000 total over 18 months. But he insisted he hadn't killed her. He'd actually been grateful for her discretion, preferred paying rather than being exposed. And on the night of the murder, he'd been in the ballroom the entire time, visible to dozens of witnesses. Byrnes checked. The alibi held. Claiborne was guilty of many things, but probably not this particular murder. J.P. Morgan was trickier. He was too powerful to interview at his home or office. That would signal weakness. So Byrnes arranged an accidental meeting at Delmonico's restaurant, the most prestigious dining establishment in New York, where Morgan lunched daily. Sitting down uninvited at Morgan's table was the kind of social violation that would normally get a man thrown out. But Byrnes's reputation preceded him. Morgan simply stared, his red nose prominent, his eyes cold. "Make it quick," he said. Byrnes laid out what he knew about the mine financing. Morgan didn't flinch. "Business," he said. "Men die in mines. It's unfortunate, but unrelated to this woman's death. I never met her, never paid her, never thought about her." But Byrnes noticed something. When Morgan said, "never thought about her," his right hand had moved unconsciously to his jacket pocket, then stopped. A tell, subtle but definitive. Morgan was carrying something related to Catherine, something incriminating enough that he'd thought about disposing of it, even in this public place. Byrnes filed that observation away. He couldn't search J.P. Morgan like a common criminal, but information was useful, even if unusable. It meant Morgan was worried, vulnerable, capable of desperate action.
William Rockefeller met Byrnes at the Standard Oil offices downtown, in a conference room that smelled of leather and cigar smoke. Rockefeller was direct, almost aggressive. "I didn't kill anyone," he said, "but I'm glad she's dead. Catherine Brennan was a parasite, a criminal who preyed on successful men. Someone did society a favor." It was a chilling statement, delivered without emotion. And it raised a question Byrnes had been avoiding. What if the murder wasn't personal? What if it was a cold business decision, ordered by someone who saw Catherine as a liability and hired a professional to eliminate her? The idea of a hired killer changed everything. If one of these wealthy men had contracted the murder, the actual killer could be anyone: a servant, a guard, a guest whose invitation had been purchased. Byrnes had been assuming the murderer was someone in that ballroom with Catherine, someone close enough to hand her poisoned wine. But what if the poison had been in the glass before she even picked it up? What if it had been placed there hours earlier, waiting? The Vanderbilt staff had prepared hundreds of glasses that night, arranged on silver trays throughout the mansion. Contaminating one would be simple for someone with access to the kitchens or serving areas. Byrnes returned to the servants. This time, he focused on the staff hired specifically for the party, temporary workers brought in to handle the massive event. The Vanderbilts employed 30 full-time servants, but for the Masquerade, they'd hired an additional 40, caterers and servers. That was 40 people whose backgrounds hadn't been carefully vetted, 40 potential infiltrators. The head butler, Charles Worth, produced hiring records. Most were from reputable agencies, with references and histories of prior society events. But 3 servers had been hired through a less formal channel, recommended by another wealthy family's household. And one of those 3 had disappeared the morning after the murder. His name, according to the records, was James Mitchell, 28 years old, experienced server, neat appearance. But when Byrnes tracked down the agency that supposedly employed him, they had no record of anyone by that name. The address he'd provided didn't exist. The references were fake. James Mitchell was a ghost, an identity constructed for one night, worn like a mask and then discarded. And he'd been working the library area, the exact section of the mansion where Catherine died. Byrnes now had his killer, or at least his primary suspect. The question remained, who had hired him? The answer came from an unexpected direction. Theodore Roosevelt, the young civil service commissioner and future president, requested a private meeting with Byrnes. They met at Roosevelt's office in Lower Manhattan, a modest space in a government building where Roosevelt was attempting to reform the corrupt patronage system that dominated American politics. Roosevelt was 31, already famous for his energy and idealism, though he wouldn't become president for another 12 years. He was agitated, pacing as he spoke. "My father," he said abruptly, "your investigation mentions him. I need to know what that woman knew."
Theodore Roosevelt Sr. had died in 1878, when young Theodore was 19. He'd been a respected businessman and philanthropist, a founder of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the American Museum of Natural History. But he'd also been a product of his era, which meant his business dealings had included partnerships with Boss Tweed's corrupt Tammany Hall machine. That was simply how business got done in 1870s New York. You paid bribes, you bought judges, you accepted that democracy was a polite fiction obscuring raw power. Roosevelt Sr. had done these things, then spent his later years trying to reform the system he'd once profited from. Catherine Brennan had somehow learned details about Roosevelt Sr.'s connections to Tweed, including specific bribes and fraudulent contracts. If that information became public, it would destroy Theodore Jr.'s political career before it even really began. Reform-minded politicians couldn't afford corrupt fathers, even dead ones. So Theodore had been paying Catherine, small amounts at first, then larger sums as her demands increased. He'd paid the last installment 3 days before the masquerade. "But I didn't kill her," Roosevelt insisted, his voice rising with characteristic intensity. "I wanted to. God help me, I thought about it. But I didn't. I was in the ballroom when she died. I can prove it." And he could. Multiple witnesses confirmed Roosevelt had been visibly present, talking with guests, dancing with his wife. He hadn't gone near the library. But that didn't mean he wasn't involved. A man didn't need to pull a trigger personally to be responsible for a death. Byrnes studied Roosevelt carefully, this energetic young man who would eventually lead the nation, and asked the crucial question:
"Did you hire James Mitchell?" Roosevelt's face showed genuine confusion. Who? The reaction seemed authentic. Either Roosevelt was innocent, or he was the best liar Byrnes had ever encountered. So if not Roosevelt, then who? Byrnes created a chart in his headquarters, connecting suspects to evidence. Cornelius Vanderbilt had the strongest personal motive, but the weakest opportunity. He'd been hosting the party, visible to everyone. Reginald Claiborne had been paying Catherine, but had a solid alibi. J.P. Morgan and William Rockefeller had clear motives, but claimed no contact with the victim. Theodore Roosevelt had motive and means, but convincing alibi. And then there was Alice Vanderbilt, the one person Byrnes kept returning to, the wife. Alice had known about Catherine's letters. She'd hidden them, which meant she was protecting her husband or herself. She'd also been the one to add 3 extra names to the guest list at the last minute. What if one of those names had been James Mitchell, admitted under a false identity? What if Alice, acting not from rage but from cold calculation, had decided to eliminate the threat to her family? Women weren't supposed to be capable of such ruthlessness in Victorian society, but Byrnes had arrested enough female criminals to know that violence had no gender preference. And Alice Vanderbilt was smart enough, connected enough, and desperate enough to plan a perfect murder. Byrnes confronted her in the mansion's conservatory, a glass-enclosed garden filled with exotic plants and the sound of a fountain. Alice was arranging orchids, her hands steady, her face composed. When Byrnes accused her directly, she didn't deny it. Instead, she set down her pruning shears, removed her gardening gloves, and said, "Prove it." It was a challenge and an acknowledgement. Yes, she was involved. Yes, she'd orchestrated Catherine's death. And yes, Byrnes could never prove it, never bring it to trial, never punish her. Because Alice Vanderbilt was protected by wealth and social status that made her effectively untouchable. The problem with investigating the wealthy, Byrnes had learned over decades, was that they operated by different rules. A poor man commits murder, you find the knife, match the blood, present the evidence to a jury, and watch him hang. A rich woman commits murder, you find the same knife, the same blood, the same evidence, and then lawyers appear. Judges who owe favors suddenly lose paperwork. Witnesses recant testimony. Evidence disappears. And the detective who pushed too hard finds himself without a job, without a pension, without any way to support himself in old age. Justice in Gilded Age America was a commodity purchased like silk or champagne. But Byrnes had never been good at accepting limitations. Maybe it was Irish stubbornness inherited from his immigrant parents. Maybe it was the memory of bodies he'd found in tenement alleys, people killed for pocket change, while millionaires got away with anything. Whatever the reason, he decided to build a case against Alice Vanderbilt, even if that case could never see a courtroom. At minimum, he'd know the truth, and maybe knowing would be enough. The evidence was mostly circumstantial, but compelling once you knew what to look for. Alice had added 3 names to the guest list: Catherine Bellamy and 2 others, both using what turned out to be false identities. One matched the description of James Mitchell, the vanished server. The other remained unidentified. Alice claimed she'd added the names as a favor to a friend whose family wanted to attend, but she couldn't remember which friend or provide any documentation. It was the kind of vague story that wouldn't fool a child, but it didn't need to fool anyone. It just needed to be deniable. The poison itself provided another clue. Cyanide wasn't difficult to obtain in 1889. It was used in photography, metallurgy, and industrial processes. But it was relatively uncommon in society circles. Except that Alice Vanderbilt was an accomplished photographer, a hobby fashionable among wealthy women. She had a darkroom in the mansion's basement, stocked with chemicals including potassium cyanide for fixing images. A bottle of cyanide from her darkroom would have the same chemical signature as the poison in Catherine's wine glass. But by the time Byrnes thought to check, the darkroom had been cleaned by the household staff. All chemicals properly disposed of, no way to test anything. And then there was the letter. Searching through Catherine Brennan's apartment on Madison Avenue, a place she'd rented under her Bellamy alias, Byrnes found correspondence that painted a fuller picture. Catherine had been in contact with someone she referred to only as A. The letters from A were careful, unsigned, but the handwriting was feminine and educated. A had given Catherine information about various wealthy men. A had suggested targets for blackmail. And in one letter, dated 2 weeks before the masquerade, A had written, "The party will be your opportunity. Come masked. I'll ensure you get in. Make your demands clear, and this will finally be over." The handwriting matched samples of Alice Vanderbilt's writing that Byrnes obtained from thank you notes and charity correspondence. It wasn't perfect evidence. Handwriting analysis in 1889 wasn't as sophisticated as it would later become, but it was enough for Byrnes to reconstruct what had happened. Alice had been using Catherine, feeding her information, encouraging her blackmail scheme. Why? Perhaps to create a situation where eliminating Catherine would seem justified, even necessary. Or perhaps Alice had genuinely thought she could control Catherine, use her as a weapon against her husband's indiscretions, only to realize too late that Catherine was too unpredictable, too dangerous.
So, Alice had invited Catherine to the masquerade under false pretenses. She'd hired James Mitchell, probably through intermediaries, carefully layered so no connection could be traced back to her, to poison Catherine's drink. The murder happened in the library because Alice had suggested Catherine wait there, told her that's where Cornelius would meet her privately. Catherine had gone willingly to her death, thinking she was about to achieve her ultimate triumph. Instead, she drunk poisoned wine and died surrounded by books she'd probably never been educated to read. A final, cruel irony. But proving any of this was impossible. James Mitchell had vanished completely, probably on a ship to Europe or South America by now, with enough money to live comfortably for years. The other mysterious guest had never been identified. Alice's letters to Catherine could be explained away as the correspondence of an innocent woman trying to understand her husband's alleged mistress. The cyanide from the darkroom was gone. And dozens of witnesses would testify that Alice had been hosting the party, chatting with guests,
perfectly visible and accounted for throughout the evening. She couldn't have personally poisoned the wine. Cornelius Vanderbilt, when Ernst confronted him with the theory that his wife had committed murder, reacted with what seemed like genuine horror. Alice? Impossible. She's delicate, refined. She couldn't possibly. But even as he spoke, Byrnes saw doubt creeping into the man's eyes. Because Cornelius knew his wife better than anyone. He knew her intelligence, her determination, her willingness to protect their family at any cost. And perhaps, in that moment, he realized what she was truly capable of. But knowing and acknowledging were different things. Cornelius would never testify against Alice. Society wouldn't allow it, and neither would his own interests. The New York Police Department's official report, filed in December 1889, listed Catherine Brennan's death as accidental poisoning, possibly self-administered. The report suggested she'd been a troubled woman with delusions about relationships with wealthy men. That she'd brought poison to the party intending to cause a scene and had accidentally consumed it herself. It was absurd, contradicted by every piece of evidence, but it was officially recorded. The case was closed. Detective Thomas Byrnes received a quiet payment of $5,000, compensation for his thorough and discreet investigation. He'd been bought off, as he'd been bought off 100 times before. But this time felt different. Byrnes deposited the money and then went home to his house in Brooklyn, a modest place despite decades of unofficial payments from the wealthy. He poured whiskey and sat by his fireplace and thought about Catherine Brennan. She'd been born in poverty, clawed her way up through intelligence and determination, tried to make the powerful pay for their cruelties, and died for her trouble. Meanwhile, Alice Vanderbilt slept in a mansion, surrounded by servants and safety. The system worked perfectly, as long as you defined worked as protecting the rich and grinding everyone else into dust. Byrnes made a decision that night. He would retire, truly retire this time, no more consulting work for wealthy families. And he would write everything down. All the corruption he'd witnessed and participated in, all the crimes that went unpunished, all the ways money transformed murder into acceptable business. He spent the next 3 years compiling what would eventually be published as Professional Criminals of America, a book that exposed the underbelly of Gilded Age society. It didn't mention Alice Vanderbilt by name. Byrnes wasn't quite brave enough for that. But anyone who read carefully could see the truth hiding between the lines.
The Thanksgiving Masquerade murder, as newspapers briefly called it before being pressured to drop the story, might have ended there. An unsolved case, a dead blackmailer, justice denied. But investigations have consequences that ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. And this case touched too many powerful people to simply disappear. Over the following months, Byrnes watched as his investigation's aftermath played out across New York society like a slow-motion collapse. Reginald Claiborne left New York in early 1890, moving permanently to Paris, where attitudes toward men like him were slightly more tolerant.
He sold his Fifth Avenue mansion to a steel magnate and never returned to America. The official story was ill health. The real story was fear. Catherine's death had reminded him how easily his secrets could be exposed, how fragile his position truly was. In Paris, he became a minor figure in the expatriate art world, hosting salons attended by Oscar Wilde and other literary figures. He died in 1903, buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery, thousands of miles from the city that would never have accepted him. Theodore Roosevelt's political career not only survived, but flourished, precisely because he'd been paying Catherine to keep his father's secrets quiet. When Byrnes discreetly destroyed the evidence of those payments, one of the few genuinely ethical acts of his later career, he freed Roosevelt from potential scandal. By 1895, Roosevelt was police commissioner of New York City, ironically tasked with reforming the same corrupt system that had let Alice Vanderbilt get away with murder. By 1901, he was president, and by then, the Brennan case was so thoroughly forgotten that when Byrnes saw Roosevelt's inauguration photograph in newspapers, he wondered if the president even remembered the woman who died at that masquerade. But some people couldn't forget. Jonathan Harding, Catherine's partner in blackmail, fled New York after testifying to Byrnes. He ended up in Chicago, where he tried to restart his social secretary career under a new name. But word travels among the wealthy, and rumors about his past made employment impossible. In 1892, his body was found in Lake Michigan, officially ruled a drowning, though the wounds on his body suggested otherwise. No one was ever charged. No one investigated too thoroughly. Harding had made himself inconvenient to powerful people, and inconvenient people had a tendency to suffer accidents. The Vanderbilt family itself continued its reign over New York society. Cornelius and Alice remained married, maintaining the facade of a loving partnership, though servants whispered about separate bedrooms and icy silences. They had 7 children total, and by all accounts were devoted parents, which raises uncomfortable questions about morality and compartmentalization. Can someone be a good mother while also being a murderer? Victorian society preferred not to examine such contradictions too closely. Alice continued her charity work, her photography, her careful management of social connections. She died in 1915 at age 76, surrounded by family, her reputation intact. But Byrnes noticed something in the years after the murder. The blackmail schemes targeting New York's elite stopped abruptly. It was as if Catherine Brennan's death had sent a message that every potential blackmailer understood. You can threaten the wealthy, you can extract some payment, but push too far, and you'll end up poisoned at a party or drowned in a lake. The murder had been a statement, a line drawn, a reminder of who really held power. And it worked. For the next decade, scandal in high society decreased noticeably, not because the wealthy behaved better, but because the people who might expose them knew better than to try.
J.P. Morgan's role in the case remained ambiguous. Byrnes never proved that Morgan had hired James Mitchell
or coordinated with Alice Vanderbilt. But coincidences suggested connections. Morgan had been Alice's financial advisor, managing portions of the Vanderbilt fortune. He had access to the kind of discreet resources: private detectives, fixers, people who solved problems quietly, that would be necessary for arranging a murder. And he had his own motivations. Catherine had been blackmailing him too. But Morgan was too smart to leave evidence, and Byrnes was too tired to keep chasing ghosts. Morgan died in 1913, one of the richest men in human history, his legacy secure, his secrets buried. The notebook Catherine had kept, the one with all those initials and payments, disappeared from police evidence sometime in early 1890. Byrnes suspected it had been stolen, probably by someone acting on orders from one of the men it implicated. He'd made copies of crucial pages, but without the original, those copies were legally worthless. He kept them anyway, tucked in a drawer at home, a reminder of the case that had broken something inside him. Years later, going through his papers after his death, Byrnes's children would find those copies and wonder what they meant. By then, everyone involved was dead, and the story had faded into obscurity. The mansion where the murder occurred was eventually torn down. Not immediately, the Vanderbilts lived there until 1914. But in 1927, Cornelius Vanderbilt III sold it to developers, who demolished it to build a commercial building. The library where Catherine died became office space, then later retail shops. Today, it's part of a different structure entirely, rebuilt several times over. Nothing remains of the physical space where the murder occurred. But in 1889, in the immediate aftermath, the mansion acquired a reputation. Servants reported strange sounds in the library at night. Guests claimed to feel uncomfortable in that room, watched by unseen eyes. The Vanderbilts dismissed it as superstition, but they stopped using the library for events, kept it locked except when necessary. Byrnes himself struggled with the case's resolution, or lack thereof. He'd spent 30 years as a detective, solving hundreds of murders, sending countless people to prison or the gallows. But the one case where he'd absolutely known who was guilty was the one he couldn't solve officially. It violated his sense of order, his belief that even in a corrupt system, some justice was possible. He drank more after the Vanderbilt case. His wife noticed. His colleagues noticed. In 1895, when he finally published Professional Criminals of America, the dedication read, "To those whose crimes were perfect and whose punishment was prosperity." People assumed it was abstract commentary on criminal masterminds. Only Byrnes knew he was thinking of Alice Vanderbilt. And what about Catherine Brennan herself, the victim everyone forgot? She was buried in a Catholic cemetery in Queens, a modest grave with a simple headstone that read, "Catherine Brennan, 1862-1889. Rest in peace." No mention of her alias, her schemes, her ambitions. Her mother had died years earlier, her father decades before. She had no siblings, no children, no one to remember her, except as a cautionary tale. Women's rights activists of the era occasionally referenced her case, not the murder itself, but what her life represented. Here was a woman who'd tried to use the only power available to her, knowledge and secrets, to escape poverty. And she'd been killed for it by another woman who had all the advantages Catherine lacked. The emerald dress Catherine wore the night she died was never returned to her estate, such as it was. It disappeared, like so much evidence in the case, into the vast machinery of cover-up that protected the wealthy. Years later, Byrnes heard a rumor, unverified, probably untrue, that Alice Vanderbilt had kept the dress, locked it away in a trunk in the mansion's attic, took it out occasionally to look at. A trophy, perhaps? Or a reminder? Or maybe just a ghost story that people told themselves, because even the rich deserve haunting.
The murder at the Vanderbilt mansion occurred at a specific moment in American history, a moment that felt permanent to the people living through it, but was actually a brief, glittering interval before everything changed. The Gilded Age, the term came from Mark Twain's novel, was already dying in 1889, though few recognized it yet. The massive inequality, the corporate monopolies, the political corruption that men like Byrnes had both fought against and participated in, all of it was approaching a crisis point that would eventually force transformation. The Panic of 1893, just 4 years after Catherine's death, shattered the illusion of infinite growth. Banks failed, railroads went bankrupt, unemployment hit 20%. Suddenly, the wealthy men who'd seemed invincible were revealed as vulnerable. J.P. Morgan would have to bail out the U.S. Treasury in 1895, using his private wealth to prevent the government from defaulting on its debts, an act of both extraordinary power and implicit admission that the system was fundamentally broken. The families who'd attended that Thanksgiving masquerade watched their fortunes fluctuate wildly, some surviving, others collapsing into genteel poverty. And the labor movement, which had been simmering throughout the 1880s, erupted. The Haymarket Affair had occurred in 1886, 3 years before Catherine's death. The Homestead Strike would come in 1892, the Pullman Strike in 1894. Workers were organizing, fighting back, demanding the dignity and compensation they'd been denied. Many of these labor actions turned violent. Police and private security forces killed strikers. Strikers killed strikebreakers. Bombs exploded. Blood ran in factory yards. It was, in many ways, a kind of civil war, though history rarely calls it that. And at its heart was a simple question: should a society allow some people to have everything while others had nothing? The Progressive Era emerged from this chaos, a reform movement that attempted to address the worst inequalities and injustices of Gilded Age capitalism. Theodore Roosevelt, the same man who'd paid Katharine Brennan to protect his father's reputation, became a progressive champion as president. He broke up monopolies, regulated corporations, expanded national parks, built the Panama Canal. It's one of history's ironies that someone who'd been entangled in the Vanderbilt murder case became the face of reform. But perhaps it made sense. Roosevelt had seen how the system worked, how power corrupted, and had decided to use his position to change it. The women's suffrage movement also gained strength in the decades following Catherine's death. Women watching the Vanderbilt case, and there were many, even if newspapers didn't report it extensively, drew various conclusions. Some saw Catherine as a victim of male power, a woman destroyed for daring to challenge wealthy men. Others saw Alice as an example of what women could accomplish, even if that accomplishment was murder. and many simply recognized that in a society where women couldn't vote, own property independently, or hold most jobs, they were forced into indirect methods of exercising power. Blackmail and manipulation were survival strategies in a system designed to exclude them. By the 1920s, the world that had produced the Thanksgiving Masquerade murder was gone. World War I had shattered old certainties. The Russian Revolution had proved that even the most entrenched aristocracies could fall. And in America, the Roaring Twenties represented a fundamental shift in culture. Women bobbed their hair, wore shorter dresses, smoked in public, voted. The strict Victorian morality that had made Catherine's blackmail schemes possible was dissolving. Scandals that would have destroyed someone in 1889 barely registered in 1929. The secrets everyone had been so desperate to protect seemed quaint, almost silly in retrospect. The Vanderbilt family itself declined in influence, though they remained wealthy. Later generations diversified their fortunes, became less visible, less ostentatiously powerful. The last Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue was torn down in the 1940s. The family that had once dominated New York society became just another wealthy family among many. Their Gilded Age literally demolished to make room for more profitable ventures. And Alice Vanderbilt's great-grandchildren, living in the 21st century, probably have no idea their ancestor committed murder. Or, if they do know, they've never acknowledged it publicly. Detective Thomas Byrnes died in 1910 at age 76, his complicated legacy secure. He was remembered as a brilliant detective who'd also been deeply corrupt, a man who'd caught criminals while protecting others, who'd reformed policing techniques while accepting bribes. His funeral was attended by both police officers and criminals, by politicians and journalists, by people who loved him and people who hated him. In his final years, he'd become something like a folk hero, the archetypal New York detective, tough, smart, morally ambiguous. Dozens of crime novels featured characters based on him, usually sanitized versions that ignored the corruption. He became myth more than man. The library where Catherine died was exorcised by a Catholic priest in 1892, at Alice Vanderbilt's request. The servants' stories about strange sounds had persisted, and while Alice publicly dismissed such superstitions, privately she was concerned enough to bring in religious authority. The priest performed the ritual quietly, no official record, just holy water and prayers and the hope that whatever lingered in that room might finally find peace. Did it work? The supernatural isn't something historians can evaluate. But the stories stopped, or at least people stopped telling them aloud. And the masquerade tradition itself faded. After the Vanderbilt murder, costumed balls became less popular among the elite, perhaps because the incident had exposed something uncomfortable about the whole concept. What were these people hiding behind their masks? What secrets were they performing? The masquerade had been a game, a way for the wealthy to pretend at mystery and romance. But Catherine's death had made the game real, had turned metaphorical masks into literal cover for murder. By the turn of the century, society parties featured costumes less often. And when they did, the atmosphere was lighter, less charged with the dangerous possibilities of anonymity. The case officially remains unsolved.
Police records from 1889 listed as accidental death, and no subsequent investigation has ever challenged that conclusion. Historians who've examined the era occasionally reference the incident as an example of Gilded Age corruption and the power of wealthy families to evade justice. But it's never been major enough to warrant deep scholarly attention, never been dramatic enough for Hollywood films or popular documentaries. Catherine Brennan died and was forgotten, her murder successful precisely because it was so thoroughly covered up. Except it wasn't entirely forgotten, because cases like this leave traces, ripples that spread across time. Descendants of the people involved sometimes discover fragments of the truth while researching family history. Archivists occasionally find documents that weren't completely destroyed. And detectives, reading Byrnes's work or studying Gilded Age crime, recognize the pattern. Wealth protecting wealth. Justice denied. A murderer who got away with it. The story survives, incomplete but persistent, waiting for someone to piece it together fully.
On Thanksgiving Day, 2024, exactly 135 years after Catherine Brennan died at a masquerade ball, New York City looks nothing like it did in 1889. The mansions are gone, replaced by skyscrapers. The Vanderbilt name appears on universities and historic sites rather than living people wielding power. The extreme inequality of the Gilded Age has been somewhat reduced, though income gaps remain vast and troubling. And masquerade balls are now children's games and Halloween parties, not the social events that shaped politics and commerce. But some things haven't changed. The powerful still commit crimes and evade consequences. Money still buys justice, or the appearance of it. And women still struggle against systems designed to limit their power, though the specific forms have evolved. Catherine Brennan would recognize aspects of the modern world, would understand that the fundamental dynamics she tried to exploit, secrets, shame, the gap between public reputation and private truth, remain potent. Technology has changed the tools, social media has changed the speed, but the game is fundamentally the same. And somewhere in New York, in archives and private collections and forgotten police files, evidence of the Thanksgiving masquerade murder still exists. Byrnes' copies of Catherine's notebook, Alice Vanderbilt's letters, if her descendants haven't destroyed them, witness statements that were never officially recorded, but that people wrote down anyway, personal accounts that survived in diaries and memoirs. The truth is out there, scattered but retrievable, waiting for someone with enough time and dedication to assemble it. This documentary has reconstructed what happened based on available evidence, contemporary accounts, and historical research. We know Catherine Brennan was murdered. We know Alice Vanderbilt almost certainly ordered that murder. We know dozens of powerful men were being blackmailed and had motives to want Catherine dead. We know the investigation was corrupted and the case was covered up. What we don't know, what we may never know, is every specific detail. The exact moment Alice decided to act, the precise method of hiring James Mitchell, the content of conversations that occurred in private rooms where no witness stood. But history isn't just about facts. It's about understanding patterns, recognizing how power operates, seeing the structures that allow some people to thrive while others are crushed. The Thanksgiving Masquerade murder matters, not because Catherine Brennan was special, though she was, in her way, remarkable, but because her death exemplifies something larger. In every era, in every society, there are people trying to climb, trying to survive, trying to make the powerful pay for their sins. And there are other people, comfortable in their power, willing to kill to maintain it. That story repeats endlessly, in different costumes, with different weapons, but with the same essential cruelty. So, on this Thanksgiving, as you sit with family and reflect on what you're grateful for, spare a thought for Catherine Brennan. Remember that the comfort many enjoy was built on systems that destroyed people like her. Remember that justice has always been unevenly distributed. And remember that every historical narrative has gaps where inconvenient truths were deliberately erased. The work of history isn't just remembering what happened. It's recovering what people tried to make us forget. If you found this story compelling, if it made you think about justice and power and the price of ambition, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and drop a comment below telling me what you think. Did Alice Vanderbilt commit murder? Should Thomas Byrnes have pushed harder? What would you have done in Catherine Brennan's position? Let's keep this conversation going, because these stories from the past aren't really about the past. They're about us, about the world we've inherited, about the choices we make when faced with injustice. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation.